Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is great that you guys came out for this, especially since the sun is out. And I have actually 3 former students in the room, so that's pretty amazing. Who came down, at least 2 of them came down from Wyoming. And thank you, Anne. I enjoyed today getting to know you, and David as well. We had a nice coffee this afternoon and found out we're both native Kansans, which is kind of nice to bond on. And you guys may know Steve has this position this year. This is Steve Hayward. I had never actually met him in the flesh until this morning, but we have been social networking friends, which is probably a black mark somewhere. But anyway, we've been social networking friends for several years now, and Steve's been a real influence on me, especially in my understanding of biography. And I don't know how many of you know Chris Kopp over there. Chris and I have actually traveled we have actually traveled to England together and back, and I've known Chris for about probably 15, a little bit more than that. He's been a huge influence and inspiration on my own work. So Chris is in classicist in the honors program here, so very glad you guys are all here. This is great. So today I brought in, this is another, I will credit social networking for this. This is a friend of mine. This is not a friend of mine, this person. This is Russell Amos Kirk, who is often regarded as the founder of modern conservative intellectual thought. Wrote a very famous book in 1953. It was actually his doctoral dissertation called The Conservative's Route. And when he published it, he changed it to The Conservative Mind. The reason that I say this has a connection to social networking is a friend of mine I've also never met from Belgium, who knows nothing about Kirk, but she and I have gotten to be friends, again, never met one another. But she's a professional artist, and she decided she knew I talked about Kirk all the time, so she actually just made this for me and sent it to me, and it's going to end up going in a book I'm working on now that I just sent off to the publisher, in fact, 2 days ago. So I'm done with that, which has been great, but it'll be a biography of Kirk. So very fun to kind of meet people in these new ways and things that I never would have expected when I was in college, certainly, and that many of the younger people are growing up with all the time. But Kirk was a really interesting figure, and I want to mention him at least briefly at this point in the talk, because I think he asks a lot of questions. We identify him. There could have never been a Goldwater movement without Kirk. He was one of Goldwater's main inspirations, along with an Austrian economist by the name of Friedrich Hayek. But he also had credited Kirk with really his own understanding of a worldview. And Goldwater's a fascinating person. I don't want to get into him too much. But he certainly, in his own day and age, he'd been a war hero. He was a pilot. He was an entrepreneur. Had come from old money, but had really made his own. He also, interestingly enough, though we remember him, and I think this is unfortunate, we remember him for his opposition to the 1964 civil rights legislation. He had been in his own private life funding throughout the 1950s lawsuits against businesses that had discriminated against peoples of African descent, and had given a huge portion of his money to defend those who had been discriminated against. So he's someone who I think we remembered incorrectly in a lot of ways because of one decision that he made. But Kirk was one of his major backers and intellectual backers. Goldwater would call Kirk, Goldwater would see Kirk, talk to him about certain ideas, how might he present things. Kirk ghost wrote a lot for him. And so we tend to remember Kirk, if we remember him at all, we remember him more for his political understandings of things. And later he was very involved with the Reagan administration. And so he always had that connection to very kind of libertarian, free market conservatism because of Goldwater. And then later on with Reagan. And that really all started with this young man who'd been a veteran, who'd gone off to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and had written this dissertation called The Conservative's Route, which was a history of conservative thought from the great Edmund Burke all the way up to T.S. Eliot, which is why I titled my own talk today, The Humane Tradition from the American Founding to T.S. Eliot, the way that I did. But Kirk really wrestled with a number of questions, especially after his book, The Conservative Mind, just blossomed in terms of popularity. I think in ways we don't remember anymore. He became a celebrity in the English-speaking world almost overnight, to the point that he himself was a kind of short, shy man who stuttered a lot. And he was in a hostel in Scotland. And this was right after the publication of The Conservative Mind. And when he registered as Russell Kirk, the clerk in the hostel said to him, "Are you the Russell Kirk who just wrote the conservative mind?" And this tells you how popular this was at the time, how much of an impact this had on really Western thinking, though we've forgotten that in a lot of ways. And I think Kirk probably hurt his own reputation by becoming involved in politics, because prior to that, his form of conservatism was not political. It was really a very deep-held and deeply founded conviction that for society to sustain itself, it has to remain true to the things that we've inherited. And that was really Kirk's fundamental idea, that every generation has to reconsider what we've taken from our parents and our grandparents, and we have to make one of three decisions. We look at those things that we've inherited, and we say, this thing is either very good, and we pass it right on, or we say this thing is terrible and immoral, and we rigorously debate, what does this mean? What's the significance for it? And then we stop it if necessary. Or the thing that happens most often, we modify it or reform it to a certain extent. That was his conservatism. It was not the conservatism of a Herbert Spencer letting the poor die in the street because that was good for social Darwinism and so forth. It was a very different kind of conservatism. It was really based, as Kirk thought, on a kind of human dignity. How do we understand? How do we conserve the human person? And so he wrestled with this, especially after the intense fame and popularity of his book, The Conservative Mind. He had to say, all right, where do I go from here? And he's only 35 at the time when it just exploded on the scene. And he really looked at the question of, all right, if I'm going to call myself a conservative, it can't be for a specific program. That is, I can't just say, I believe in this when it comes to subsidies, or this when it comes to education, or this when it comes to the number of warheads or tanks that we need to have. His question became something much deeper than that. And his argument was that the true conservative must be, at some level, fundamentally a humanist. That the conservative is only effective if she or he is conserving the best of the humane tradition. If there's really a recognition of what is deeply humane in any institution or any policy. So if it just becomes some kind of knee-jerk responsiveness or a reactionary kind of element, if it just becomes some reactive thing, Kirk was fundamentally very skeptical of that. And he thought that we have to give this a different kind of understanding. And this is why, and I try not to stress this too much, only because of certain things that are expedient with my own position at my own college and the kind of relations that we have with other people in the conservative world. But if you look at a lot of modern conservatives, people who call themselves conservatives, especially a lot of radio show hosts, really what they've done is they've commodified conservatism. They have not promoted it as much as they've turned it into sound bites. And that is exactly the kind of thing Kirk said we could not do. That a conservatism that was worth explaining might take an hour to debate just at the beginning. It might take days, it might take months, it might take years, it might take generations to understand. And Kirk was very, very worried that things that we might take as these are fundamentally American beliefs, even something as simple, which is not simple, but on the face of it, as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we could take this and somehow make it kind of a political platform and just make it an easy kind of platitude that we could repeat constantly. And Kirk said those things may be utterly true. We may in fact have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But unless we understand the foundation of that, we really are going to miss the centrality of it and the importance of that thing for later generations. So again, this takes me back to this idea of what then is this humane tradition that Kirk is trying to look at, and others as well. What is it that we might find worth conserving? And again, that doesn't mean that we would just say, well, the American Constitution is new, and therefore, how could we really judge it by the standards of history? Is it worth conserving? Or the Declaration? He didn't take it that far. He was not so much of a curmudgeon or a reactionary that anything modern was wrong, though Kirk himself was quite quirky about a lot of things. He hated the telephone. He threw a TV once that had been smuggled into his house out of the attic because he was so furious that his children had brought it in. There are some crazy stories. He refused to drive in places. He never invested his money in banks because he thought this was immoral. He actually was one of these guys who put money in a jar and buried it out in the backyard. He was quite wealthy because he had earned a lot from his books. But so there are quirks about him, and I don't want to suggest somehow he was separate from all of those things. But he still was not to the point where we throw all of this out. Instead, again, it's one of those things, we inherit something and we have to judge it. And we have to judge it immediately. This is our duty. Every generation has to spend its time judging what has come before and what to do with that. Should we pass it on? Should we reform it? Or should we end it? And so for Kirk, and for these other humanists that I think are worth considering and worth preserving, they often would start in the larger Western tradition. They almost always went all the way back to Socrates, sometimes depending on the religious tradition, back into the Hebraic traditions as well. But certainly if you're talking to a general audience of people who might come from a religious background or even a mixed religious and secular background, it would be better to really look back and focus on someone who could transcend those kinds of religious differences that you might find. So Kirk, as well as people like T.S. Eliot and others, look back really to the Socratic tradition. And they saw within Socrates, this great Athenian philosopher, they saw within him the model for a number of things. First of all, he was a martyr, and a very interesting martyr. He was a person who accepted the execution of the state because he believed that it was for the good of that community. Maybe not at the moment, but over time. But even before he died, he was willing to state to his close friend Crito, when they discussed what does all this mean, Socrates said quite clearly, there would be no sense in me doing a wrong, or anyone ever to do a wrong, because the moment you do a wrong, you're damaging your soul, and you're damaging the soul of your community. And that Socratic ethic of never doing wrong becomes really central to the whole humanist proposition, to the understanding that this is at the essence of what is humane. Now, for those of us who come out of a religious tradition, we'll see the same thing in the Jewish tradition, of course, especially through the Pharisaic teachings of Hillel and others. In the Christian tradition, it becomes very obvious in the teaching and the being and life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. So you see this in non-secular contexts as well, but it can be rooted, at least that humanist tradition is deeply rooted in a pre-religious, or at least a non-Judeo-Christian kind of ethic as well. And then you have the whole gamut of thinkers, and I don't want to go into the entire line of them in any detail, but from their understanding, if you brought together a number of these people, a number of humanists in the 20th century, and we could be as diverse as someone like Jacques Maritain on one side and maybe T.S. Eliot on the other, or if we pick a Romano Guardini, or later the person who will become John Paul II, a Karol Wojtyła, who was deeply involved in these movements as well in the 1950s especially, you find that they had a kind of common lineage of who they thought was in this great tradition and what that great tradition would stand for. So you have Socrates, of course, and Plato and Aristotle, but there's always that kind of fine debate that we don't necessarily need to get into here, but do you look more to the kind of otherworldliness of Plato or the more empirical side of Aristotle that they would debate? And then you have people like the Stoics, Zeno, Cleanthes, those who were looking for a natural law, looking for a kind of intelligence that governed the whole universe. And then we would jump forward to the great Romans, to Cicero, to Tacitus, to Livy, to Virgil, to Cicero. All of these figures who really lived a kind of republican, small r, republican lifestyle. What did it mean to be a citizen of the Republic, of the res publica? What did it mean to give oneself over to that community? And then we get into the Christian tradition, and we see a very important figure, St. Augustine, that almost all of these humanists would look back to. Others, of course, earlier than that, St. John, St. Paul, later St. Thomas, Bonaventure, Sir Thomas More, all of these figures that they tended to look at as a lineage. And they saw most of it culminating in the figure of Edmund Burke. They thought that Burke, the great Anglo-Irish statesman of the 18th century, was really the embodiment, not only of the best of politics, but also the embodiment of the best of this Western tradition. That whole tradition, starting with Socrates all the way up to his era. Burke, as they saw him, they idealized him, there's no doubt. They're not taking necessarily the real Burke in every aspect, but they're mythologizing him and making him something a little bit larger than life. They saw him as this truly grand figure on the stage of things. And the fact that he was arguing a time of revolution and upheaval, the American Revolution here and of course abroad, with the French Revolution, but he himself was an advocate of Irish rights, of Asian Indian rights, of Roman Catholic rights, of American rights. This puts him in a very interesting position. And they saw him as a very prophetic figure, not only because of what he inherited, but because he would speak to us as a people in the 1950s who had to confront communism, or earlier, confront Nazism. Burke had done that earlier, as they saw it, by confronting both the American as well as the French Revolution. And I want to read to you just a brief passage from Burke, something that many of these humanists tend to look back to. And I don't want to suggest that, again, across the board, we could take every one of these people in the 1950s or 1960s and say that they all thought alike. Quite often, they would radically disagree with one another, and they would have very serious debates with one another. Christopher Dawson arguing against Jacques Maritain, Voegelin debating Strauss. There were a number of different figures who were really going after each other, but looking back at them, they have a lot more in common, I think, than they have not in common. But this was one of the great passages that people would take from Burke, and whether we agree with it or not, it is a beautiful passage. And I always have to remind myself that this was originally written as a speech before a public body. So I would give almost anything for any politician in America to be able to speak like this today. This is absolutely a lost art. But he writes, and he says, again, a speech originally, he says, taking it for granted, this is 1791, Burke, taking it for granted that I do not write to the disciples of the Parisian philosophy, I may assume that the awful author of our being is the author of our place in the order of existence, and that having disposed and marshaled us by his divine tactic, not according to our will, but according to his, he has in and by that disposition virtually subjected us to the part which belongs to the place assigned to us. Now, I want to unravel that for a moment, because there's a lot in that one sentence here that Burke is giving us. But he's answering, or at least attempting to answer, and again, we don't have to agree with him, and these are some of the most complex issues that have ever been brought up in Western civilization, and really in all human civilization. He's asking a fundamental question, ultimately about the virtue of justice. Where is justice? What is justice? Where does it reside? And for someone like Burke, or for the humanists in particular in the 1940s and 50s, 60s, and so forth, justice was an absolutely perfect, transcendent thing. It was very Platonic. It existed in a realm that we could not see, but we could in some way perceive, but very, very darkly. And so the argument would not be, and if I took all of us in this room and I asked us what a definition of justice is, that they would readily agree that we would all disagree. And that's just to be expected. We're all individual. We all have our own cultural contexts, our own ethnicity, our own way of speaking, our own way of thinking, our own religion or lack thereof. All of these things shape who and what we are. But for someone like Burke, at the end of all of that, we would still agree that there is a transcendent justice, even if we don't know what that thing is. But we continue to reach for it. And we accept that it does exist at some level. So Burke is in large part asking us, what is justice? And if you remember, in the classical understanding of justice, the definition of justice was to give each person his or her due. That this is what justice is, a recognition that somehow, again, coming from a religious background, we might say we're lower than the angels but higher than the animals. This is a form of justice. It's not a very specific one, but it's a form of justice. Or we might say that I was born in this time, in this place. I have certain obligations to my parents, and I have certain obligations to my children. That's also a form of justice. Neither is necessarily right or better than the other, but instead we have to accept all of these at the same time. So when Burke says the awful author of our being, right, God, when he puts us in a place, it is our duty to try and figure out, though we never will, and not by any stretch of the imagination will we ever fully understand this. But our job is to try and understand why here, why now. Yeah, so any of us in this room, why? Why here? Why now? We all have different motives for being here. There are other things we could have done. We have given up certain things to be in this room right now. We may want to meet someone in the room. We may want to hear the talk. We may want the talk to stop. There could be all things that we want. And Burke's suggestion is, and I think it's a very powerful suggestion, in all of those things, there are so many complications that they cannot be brought down to just a number or a fact or statistic. This is one of the most important things about the human condition, and that is we have to recognize there are so many things we don't know. In fact, we probably don't know far more than we will ever know. And there's a mystery that really must just be accepted, and at some level, maybe even celebrated, even as we try and strive against that darkness of what we don't know. So Burke picks this up a little bit, and of course, he's speaking here specifically to the English people. He's saying, look, you've got these crazies, as he sees it, across the water. These people who are about to spread their revolutionary infection everywhere, and you have to kill it now. It has to stop. This was his argument. So there's a reason Britain is here and now. There's a reason that Britain has this power. There's a reason, as he says it, that has to be brought up. So this is why he brings up the Parisian philosophy. So he continues here, and here he takes on John Locke and other thinkers of the 17th century Enlightenment. He says, we have obligations to mankind at large that are not the consequence of any special voluntary pact. They arise from the relationship of man to man and the relationship of man to God, which relations are never matters of choice. On the contrary, the force of all the pacts which we enter into with any particular person or number of persons amongst mankind depends upon those prior obligations. In some cases, the subordinate relations are voluntary. In others, they are necessary. But the duties are always compulsive. And for those of you who've taken any courses in the great books, or if you know the Western tradition, this is just reeking of Cicero here. This whole idea of what defines the human person, not rights, but duties. What is it that you're willing to give to one another? This is how we judge at the end of all things. We judge someone by what they've given, not by what they've taken. So in some cases, the subordinate relations are voluntary, and others they are necessary. But the duties are all compulsive. When we marry, the choice is voluntary, but the duties are not a matter of choice. They are dictated by the nature of the situation. Now, again, we can agree or disagree with some of the elements of that, but the image remains, and that is, just as we do not have a choice, that we are born into a time and place, we have all the choice in the world to do with what we have during that time and place. This is what Burke is suggesting here. So there may be a predestinarian element in our arrival in this world, but what we do beyond that is a matter of choice. And of course, Burke is engaging not only philosophical discourse going all the way back to the Greeks, but he's engaging very serious Christian doctrine as well. That do we choose a more Augustinian Calvinist view of looking at things, or do we have a more Thomistic look at free will and so forth? And here's where I think this is where Burke is not only a great thinker, but such a great writer as well. His next line, now remember, this is a political speech he gives. So after all that, he ends this by saying, dark and inscrutable are the ways by which we come into the world. Now that's just beautiful writing. Dark and inscrutable. And of course, how true is that? We don't get to choose these things, but yet there it is. And that mystery for Burke is something that has to be embraced and at some level celebrated, though also recognized as a shackle upon us as well. And these are all things that he wants to take into account. It's not an either or, but really a both and. So let me offer three thoughts, looking back to this kind of Burkean tradition, but hopefully, and maybe it's somewhat postmodern, but to look at this whole lineage as well, this Socratic tradition. So three things that I think, if we want to say, what is conservatism really? What is it that we hope to conserve in society? for those of us, and even if we're not conservative, maybe we say, good, we have the conservatives out there. Let's let them speak their mind and maybe not commodify things, but actually have serious discourse, not at the level of the bumper sticker, but at the level of the serious book and academic work, something akin to what Kirk wrote with The Conservative Mind. So these are my three thoughts that I think allow us to maybe understand what the best of conservatism was. Again, not that there weren't problems with it, there were some very serious ones, there still are, and certainly we've seen the direction that it's gone in the last 20 or so years, especially in its commodification. But the first thing that I think is important is the idea of what the ancients, and especially Aristotle, would have called balance. This notion of, and it applies to justice as well, but this notion of recognizing ourselves, not as the end-all be-all, but as a part of a larger community, in a relationship. And of course, for us who come out of the American tradition, what better thing could we see in the American founding with the creation of the Republic, of the res publica, the idea of the common good? What do we give to it? And I think we often don't take into account, we've allowed certain people to kind of hijack the founding and make it this kind of radical free market movement, when in fact, yeah, that element was there, but what the founders were really, really interested in was the right of association. This was more important. So owning a business is certainly a part of the right of association, but the right to form a school or a community or a voluntary association or a church, these things were equally important to them. And we see those enshrined, especially in the Northwest Ordinance of the American founding, 1787, passed unanimously on July 13th of 1787 by Congress. A powerful statement about the right to property. Property is not the right to own stuff, and that can be a benefit. Property is ultimately about the right to work with someone and not to be interfered with at a political level, so that we have the right to associate and to work with one another. That was fundamental. So this idea of community and the balancing, I think, very importantly, of the needs of the individual person with the needs of the community. Not an either or, but a both and. And here again, to go back to Aristotle, that we can imagine from the Politics, when Aristotle speaks of political community, he says man is by nature a political animal. And to be outside of politics is to be either a beast or a god. And we know that most of us probably would tend towards one and not the other. And that's exactly Aristotle's point. It's in community that we find the best of our individual selves. We are not isolated, but we become actual persons in relationship one to another. Number two, I think we have to understand that there is also an element in that community of what we might call fulfillment. And by this, we could go back to the 60s, the 1960s, and we could think about the preferences of human society, desire, Maslow's understanding, and so forth. But I think here we're really talking about ultimate happiness. That is, what is it that we find our fulfillment in? And I think it's pretty clear that most people over time do not actually find satisfaction in hedonism. They might for a moment, they might get into the habit of it over years, but we find that most people, especially towards the end of their lives, as they're thinking back, what did their lives mean? They generally are concerned with what is it that they gave to their community? What is it that they left grandchildren, whatever, the neighbor children, whatever it may be. Very few people die thinking how great I accumulated all of this and I'm taking it with me. And that's a long, long time ago that we had those kinds of pyramid builders. And there may be people who fooled themselves into that. But we know that the vast majority of people who are satisfied are those who believe they know who they are and have lived out a life that has led to the common good, to something in bettering their own society. Yeah, this is why we don't generally see on tombstones, I had a great time, I lived for myself. It's not, but I also think of the opposite. Think about someone like the great poet John Keats, who said, I was but a personality writ upon water. Now that too is terribly sorrowing in many ways, but that romantic understanding, I think, probably gets a little bit closer to our existence than he who dies with the most toys wins. The final thing that I would say, and this is from my own love, and this is, of all of these things, I might be able to defend points 1 and 2 somewhat objectively. The third, though, is just purely subjective and a real love. One thing that I have found in my own studies, and one of the great enjoyments of my life, has been able to read as much as possible about not only biography, but especially mythology. And I think we've lost in this present world, it's being regained, but again, it's being commodified and popularized in strange ways through Harry Potter and so forth. But I think that there is a really deep need for the human person to be able to connect to the things across time that have mattered to all peoples. And it would be very difficult for any one of us to pick up Homer and not find things that are relevant to every moment of our lives. Granted, we may not be in the great wars of the Iliad, and we may not experience all of the insanities of the Odyssey, but the story is a story of the human condition, no matter how mythologized it is. And we find those things repeatedly that we keep coming back to in society. Our society, over time, and especially as a Western civilization, we have come back to Homer, we've come back to Virgil, we've come back to Dante, we have come back to Milton, and I predict someday we'll probably come back to Tolkien as well, maybe 500 years from now. I think he is the great myth maker of the modern world. But all of them, to pick up Virgil, to look at the Aeneid, it is an astounding story in every way. It deals with hope, it deals with loss, it deals with love, it deals with witchcraft, it deals with suicide. Anything that you can imagine in the human condition is in a story like the Aeneid. Or if you've read Dante, and forget whatever your own religious predilections are, to read Dante and to realize one of the greatest moments in all of literature is when Dante realizes he's no longer in hell. It's just incredible where he sees Cato the Younger on the shore of Purgatory. And Purgatory is not a great place to be. Purgatory is pretty nasty, but it is so much better than hell. And you feel that, the way that Dante is able to invoke that and to see absolute evil. And even the lesser evil of Purgatory is such a relief and enlightenment. It is, for any of you who've read it, it has to be one of the greatest moments ever in literature, to be able to escape the coffin and realize you're given a second chance. No matter what, even if you come from a background which says Purgatory is nonsense, in a literary standpoint, from a literary standpoint, this is brilliant. And that kind of hope that's there, and it, certainly, I'm age 46, but I have found in my own teaching, and I teach at an odd, beautiful little place that's very self-selecting, 3 of you know it intimately, but it is an unusual place. But I have found in my 15 years of teaching there, students crave these kinds of stories. Even if they think they're hokey or ridiculous at points, they are touched by these. They recognize that in the story of Dante, there is something that touches us all. His love of Beatrice, whatever that love is that we all have that. They're all things we desire, and we know and we want them. And maybe not like Dante, we don't recognize that our love was a false love and we were actually, Beatrice came to represent something else. But we recognize that there are those longings we have. When we read about the men in the Odyssey who are turned into pigs, though their brains remain human, it's a horrifying moment because you realize how trapped they are. And of course, the goddess, when she does this, as cruel as she is, she's making a point. You're greedy, you're nasty. And even when we look at mythologies out of the Western tradition, if we look at Sioux mythology, look at Lakota mythology in the opening story where 2 men are walking and they encounter a white goddess. And when she appears to them, one lusts after her. Of course, she strikes him down. And the other says, "You are obviously wise, teach me your laws." And this was the lawgiver. He was the first to receive the law of the gods. And those stories, do we take them literally? How many of us worship at the altar of the white buffalo woman? Probably very few in this room, if any. But yet, is there not a truth in that story? Does that story not teach us something fundamental? And so, for me, if anyone said, no one's been crazy enough to do this, but if someone ever said, Birzer, if you wanted to design a liberal arts college, what would you do? I probably would have nothing in the first year but reading of this literature. To me, this would be the greatest introduction to the ancient world, to the medieval world, and to the modern world. To read these myths, to understand them, to linger over them, to dwell in them, and I think really to make them a part of who and what we are. So I've pretty much run my time. I do want to end with one other thing, and I want to end with something that I think is very important. And I started with Kirk, so I would like to end with Kirk, and especially as he understood certain things. And I mentioned T.S. Eliot in my title, and I would be remiss not talking about him at all. He and Kirk became very good friends in 1953. In fact, they became very, very close friends. And Eliot had asked Kirk to write the first biography that would appear of him after he passed away. And Kirk did it. Kirk wrote Eliot and His Age, which was one of his best-selling books that he published in 1971 through Random House. It did very well. And one of the reasons that Eliot wanted Kirk to write this is because from the first moment they met, they sat together at a play. And they sat next to each other watching one of Eliot's plays performed for the first time. And at the end of it, Kirk, being this shy but also kind of genius upstart, turned to Eliot and he said, "This is what your play's about." And he listed it exactly. And Eliot was both horrified and also very taken, because he said that Kirk got it absolutely. That he was just shocked at how well Kirk, who'd never seen this, just nailed it. And so later on he said, "If anyone's going to write about me, I want you to be the first, because I want people to get the story right, at least as I understand it." Eliot himself was not arrogant, by the way. It may sound like it, he wasn't. He was actually very humble. But he wanted Kirk to write that. One of the things that meant so much to Kirk was Eliot's earlier poetry. And so I want to do two things here to end. A quote first from Eliot and then from Kirk, as Kirk talks about what this might mean for us in where we're all sitting in an academic setting. So for those of you who've read Eliot's poetry, and I was first, and I'm very grateful for this, I was introduced to Eliot. I had no idea who he was, but I was introduced to him my senior year of high school. And I was forced, I had to memorize the Hollow Men before I could graduate. And that was a great experience for me. It was very difficult, but it also was very good. And then we went on to read Murder in the Cathedral and so forth. And I've actually kept Eliot and his collected works next to my bedside since high school. That may sound really bizarre, but he has always been there. And through good and bad times, he has been very important to me, in large part because I think his language is so beautiful. But if you remember from The Hollow Men, and I unfortunately don't have it memorized anymore, but for those of you who've read The Hollow Men, it is in the middle period of Eliot's poetry. In the 19-teens, he writes a lot of bizarre, I mean, he's got the cooking egg and the hippopotamus and so forth, very strange kind of plays on words. But he also writes his phenomenal work, The Wasteland, which Ezra Pound then edits way down. And we now know, and we didn't know this until the early 1970s, but looking at the original Wasteland and what Pound did to it, he changed. The poem is utterly different, to the point where it's as much Pound's poem, I think, as it is Eliot's in the end. But that's neither here nor there. But what we find in Eliot is that he moves dramatically through a Dante-esque, intentionally Dante-esque way of looking at the world. So during World War I, it's hell. And The Wasteland is a series of vignettes and images of what hell would be, with some possibilities of goodness, but generally hell. When you look at his middle poetry, and especially when you look at things like The Hollow Men, or you look at Ash Wednesday later on, this is a purgatorial phase for Eliot. Things are not as horrible as they were, but they're also not great yet. And then when you get to the four quartets, and I would argue, and I realize this is a huge claim to make, especially because I'm being filmed, and this can come back to haunt me, but I do believe it. I do think the four quartets are the greatest work of art of the 20th century. And that's a huge claim, I realize. But it's something that I think for any of you who've read the four quartets, and I've had the great privilege of teaching it 4 times now in various classes at Hillsdale, it is just a work that no matter how many times you pick it up, there are layers and layers and layers of depth. And of course, they're as pagan as they are hopeful in the end. They're based on the 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, water, and then ultimately put into faith, hope, and love, and the idea of grace. But in The Hollow Men, in this middle purgatorial period, we see Eliot really struggling. And I want to read two stanzas from The Hollow Men just to grasp what he's getting at. I think he's making an amazing critique of modernity in the world between the 2 wars. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom, remember us, to death's other kingdom. If as at all, not as lost violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams, in death's dream kingdom. These do not appear. There the eyes are. Sunlight on a broken column. There is a tree swinging, and voices are in the wind singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises, the rat's coat, the crow's skin, the crossed staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves, no nearer, not that final meeting in the twilight kingdom. And we get that real sense of despair here. Here is Eliot. He's out in the wasteland, his own personal wasteland. But he tries to end this whole poem on a positive note, but he can't. And here his religious imagery is absolutely stunning. And you have to kind of see how he plays. He loves doing this, and only in modern poetry could you do this. You have the main story here in this column, but you have the response. These are Greek choruses, essentially. And he loved playing with these on stage. Usually he would have very lower class English working men in denim singing these things that once the Greeks would have sung in Greek. But he has the response, so it's a call and response. Here's Eliot, here's the response as he's trying to figure it out. And some of this you'll know because of Bertrand Russell. And Eliot lived, he and his wife lived with Russell for about a decade. Here we go around the prickly pear, the prickly pear, the prickly pear. Here we go around the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. Here's the response. For thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow, the response. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. And here's Eliot struggling. For thine is, life is, for thine is. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Now that's an astounding autobiographical confession because, of course, he is longing for truth in transcendence, but he can't get there. It would be dishonest for him to accept that. So his world is not the world of the power and the glory. It's the world of death. And that's all he can get at this point. Later, again, the Four Quartets answers all of this. And if you haven't read it, I envy you, because I'd give a lot to be able to read it for the first time again. And it really is a work of intense beauty. But this is one of the things, Kirk was asked by Eliot to write a number of different books. And one of the books that Kirk wrote almost immediately after meeting Eliot was a book on academic freedom. And this will be my end here. And I want to read to you what Kirk wrote in a very Eliot voice about what the meaning of freedom in academia is. And Kirk, one of his greatest books, which has been almost utterly forgotten, was his 1954 book, so 60 years old now, just simply called Academic Freedom, an essay and definition. He goes through all the cases at the time then at the University of Nevada, Illinois, a number of places where professors were being fired simply because they were Marxist, or whatever it may be, or presumed to be Marxist, and Kirk just had no time for that kind of intolerance. An academy has to be one in which you have dialogue. That doesn't mean you allow the Marxist to get away with everything, or the tyrant to get away with everything, but it's better to have the voice and to debate it in open than to hide it and to do the McCarthyite thing. So Kirk writes, and I love this. This to me is also just great writing. Here's a 36-year-old writing. To what truths, then, ought the academy to be dedicated? To the proposition that the end of education is the elevation of reason of the human person, for the human person's own sake and for nothing more. To the proposition that the higher imagination is better than any immediate sensate triumph. To the proposition that the fear of God and not the mastery over other men and nature is the object of learning. To the proposition that quality is worth always more than quantity. To the proposition that justice is always better than power. To the proposition that order is always better than egoism. To the proposition that to believe all things if the choice must be made is more noble than to doubt all things. To the proposition that honor outweighs success. To the proposition that tolerance is always wiser than ideology. To the proposition, both Socratic and Christian, that the unexamined life is never worth living. If the academy holds by these propositions, not all the force of Caesar will ever break down its walls. And if the academy is bent upon sneering at everything in heaven and earth, and upon reforming itself after the model of the marketplace, then God help them, not all the eloquence of the prophets will save the academy. Thank you. Good. I ran over 10 more minutes than I was supposed to, Ann. I'm sorry.
Not
but
thank you.
We still have
questions?
Or thoughts?
Thoughts? Comments?
Yes, please.
This is going to be a bit broad, but
you
have quoted and or referred to those in antiquity all the way up pretty much to the present.
Yes.
In the different phases of writing in their positions. Where would you put them there?
Well,
now,
yes.
In relationship with their spiritual
sure.
life, conservatism, and all those aspects that you have brought up today.
Yeah, I had the great fortune of being able to speak for Dr. Hayward's class this morning and the question that I was asked, oh, there's a microphone here, I didn't realize that, or at least this is a hollow spot or something. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. The question is a great question because we have to ask, where do we fit into this long tradition, and especially where does the American tradition fit in? So in Dr. Hayward's class, I got to talk a little bit about how America sees itself vis-a-vis the ancient world, and I drew heavily, Dr. Kopp has done some, as a classicist, has done some incredible work on the American founding and the relationship of the founding to antiquity. But one of the things we find, and there were a number of influences on the American founders, I mean, there were several major influences and a lot of minor influences, and of course the founding, you know, we can date it for almost an over 40-year period from roughly around 1761 all the way up really to the Lewis and Clark venture. That was all part of this kind of founding era. So there are a lot of ideas that go into it. There's no doubt that the vast majority of Americans, especially those who were participating freely in society, came from a very specific Christian understanding, though they're divided between kind of Calvinists in New England and High Church Anglicans in Virginia, and then a lot of people in between. So that's one phase. And a person who's done some very good work on this, Don Lutz at the University of Houston, a Vogelidian scholar, has argued that if you look at the number of references to people in the founding debates, so whether it's at the debate over the Declaration or the Constitution, and you just number, he takes the 36 most cited people in all of these great debates. He did incredible work on this, really serious scholarship. He finds that number one, without any question, is St. Paul. That nobody referenced anyone in antiquity or anywhere else more than St. Paul. Paul was just, and if you actually gave it a fair numbering, he would basically be number 1 through 9, and then number 2 would be number 10. And that's how often, and that's pretty clear, and that shouldn't surprise us given that American colonies were born in the Reformation. They are very much, absolutely a Reformation people. And we'd be lying if we tried to escape that. It's fundamental. But the other thing that they had, and I think very importantly, of course they're a very well-read generation, an extremely well-read and extremely well-educated generation, they look to antiquity all the time. So if we get, and I mentioned all this in Dr. Hayward's class this morning, but even if you just pick up an edition of the Federalist Papers, so the 80-some, I think it's 85 Federalist Papers, 86, 85 Federalist Papers that were written in 1787 and 88, and you look at the index, the only contemporary that they're citing, and they cite him all the time, is Montesquieu. And so they're always looking at Baron Montesquieu. But look at somebody else that we think of as very important in the founding, someone like John Locke. And I think we would all agree, he's very important for the Declaration. But when you look at the Federalists, he's not mentioned once, not one time. And then if you look up at how often the founders themselves in the Federalist Papers, so 3 authors, how often they looked at antiquity, there are 56 references to antiquity. So they're always looking to antiquity, and it's not just there, it's in the anti-federalist debates everywhere. They're looking back to the founding. And so I think one of the questions we have to ask, and part of this humanistic understanding, is why? What is it that was so important to them about antiquity? And for them, and they were political theorists, but they were also very practical men. They saw the lessons of history there. And it was very important to them that they are founding a republic. It's not a monarchy, it's not an aristocracy, and it's not a democracy. It was a republic. And aside from a few of the medieval republics like Iceland, which was not going to be our example, it's not going to be our model, or some of the early modern republics in Venice and elsewhere, the last major republic was Rome. And so they had to look to Rome. They had to. There was no other place they could really look if they wanted to found a republic. It was in antiquity. And so they drew those lessons. But it goes even farther than that. And this is some of the stuff that, and I take a lot of this from Christian Kopp. There's another scholar, Forrest McDonald, who's done a lot of on this. But if you look at the average educational level of the American founders, those who were involved in the Declaration and so forth, the vast majority of them were formally educated in colleges. So, which was not the norm at the time, but they themselves had been educated, and all of their education would be what we would call liberal education. And liberal education for them didn't mean liberal politically. Liberal meant to be liberated from the things of this world. So if you know the truth of Socrates, well, it doesn't matter if this tyrant or that tyrant is beating you around. You've got the truth of Socrates. It's timeless. And that was their, so you're liberated. And they used to talk about, it would be better to be the slave Epictetus and have a free soul than it would be to be Nero and have all the power in the world. Because they would talk about Epictetus the slave was actually a free man because he knew Socrates. Whereas Nero was the slave because he was enslaved to his passions, even though he had all the power in the world. That's pretty beautiful. Yeah, even if it takes it too far, there's something quite stunning in that. So one of the things I read today in Dr. Hayward's class was just the average entrance requirements for any of the 9 colleges in the colonies. And I don't have it exactly right here, so I'm paraphrasing a bit. But to get into college, and it was only for men. Right? Women didn't go to college, at least in the United States, until the 1840s, and at least receive a liberal arts degree. And I'm very proud of the fact that the college I teach at was the very first college in America to offer a liberal arts degree to women. It was also colorblind from day one. It was founded as an abolitionist college. But aside from that, when you look at the founding, only men went to college, at least in America. And here is the requirement. They were age 14. The average male went to college from 14 to 17, so a little bit different than now. But the requirement was they would hand you 3 of Cicero's orations in English, and you had to translate them to Latin. And then they would hand you the first 3 of Virgil's, first 3 books of Virgil's Aeneid, which takes you up to the Dido story. And you would have to translate that from Latin into Greek. And then they would give you the first 9 chapters of St. John's Gospel, and you would have to translate that from Greek into English. That was your entrance requirement, just to even be considered.
At 14.
At 14. And so we've lost this. But this makes sense to us that when we look, and we look at the founding, of course they were ancient. This is what they grew up with. St. John was as much a part of them as Virgil was. And it was just a part of what they lived and breathed. And there are obvious symbols of this. The fact that the American capital is based on mid-period Roman republicanism, that is an obvious symbol. I mean, we're making a statement to the world we're the new Roman Republic. The fact that we take the name Senate and so forth. But one of my favorite examples, and I'm probably answering you far more than you want, but I think it's a great question, and I love this topic. My favorite, I had a chance in my last work to write on one of the lesser known founders, a man by the name of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. And he died in 1832, he was 95. An amazing guy, he was actually still, and I told Steve's class this, he went horseback riding that morning. And he's just an incredible guy. De Tocqueville met him the year before, and they really hit it off with one another. He was one of the main informants for de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America. But when he dies on November 14th of 1832, the 2 newspaper headlines that went out, and they went out together. So all across America, here's the last of the founders, and to the last signer of the Declaration. And before that, of course, Adams and Jefferson had died 6 years earlier on July 4th of 1826, of all days. So the headline that goes out is, "A great man in Israel hath fallen. The last of the Romans has died." That's incredible to think about. They saw him as a Jewish prophet and as a Roman Republican. It's just, what do you do with that? There's so much richness in that. So I think if we want to understand the founding, if we don't get that sense that this is who they were and this is what shaped them, we're going to miss a huge aspect of what they were trying to do and what was important to them. So I even found, I came across this great newspaper editorial in a Cincinnati newspaper. 1820, frontier, wild German, high-drinking town. Oh, Cincinnati was the Vegas of its day. And everybody knew that. It had this terrible reputation. But one of the editorials, 1820, it said, if we ever lose liberal education, I give us about 3 generations before we're all barbarians again. That was pretty standard thinking. So thank you for that. That was far more than you wanted to know, but thanks. It's fun stuff to talk about.
Thank you.
So
Dr. Carlos.
we are going to thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
For the stimulating talk and for answer to the question. So please join me in thanking Dr. Birzer. We have a couple of minutes if